The sun did not set in Rook's Hollow so much as it collapsed, bruising the horizon with shades of violent violet and dried blood. It was the summer of 1885, a season that had stretched itself thin over the Wyoming territory, wringing the moisture from the earth until the ground cracked open like an unhealed wound. The town itself was a collection of gray, sun-bleached timber huddled at the base of the foothills, a place where hope dried up faster than the creek. What had once been a rushing river was now a muddy ribbon, choked with silt and the rotting carcasses of cattle too weak to pull themselves from the mire. Dust hung in the air, a permanent, gritty veil that coated the back of the throat and settled in the creases of weathered faces. Ribs stuck out through the hides of the livestock that remained, staring with dull, glassy eyes at the empty water troughs. Men sat on porch steps, whittling sticks into nothingness, their tempers shortened by the relentless heat, while women beat dust from rugs that would only be dirty again by sundown. 2 miles outside of town, where the scrub brush grew thick and the land turned jagged with limestone, Eliza lived in a cabin that leaned slightly to the west, as if bracing itself against the prevailing wind. She was 28 years old, though the harsh country had etched fine lines around her eyes that made her look older. She moved through the brittle brush with a quiet economy of motion, a wicker basket hooked over her arm. Eliza was not a woman of leisure. She was a creature of necessity. Her hands were stained with the green sap of sage and the dark juice of elderberries. She knelt by a cluster of yarrow, her fingers deftly separating the white flowers from the stalks. The townsfolk called this a weed. Eliza knew it as a way to stop a man from bleeding to death. She paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The silence out here was heavy, broken only by the dry rattle of cicadas and the distant, mournful lowing of a cow. Down in Rook's Hollow, they called her many things. A spinster, a hermit, but when the whiskey lowered their voices and the shadows grew long, they called her witch. It was a title born of fear and ignorance. She had no husband, no children, and she understood things that frightened the God-fearing folk of the valley. She knew which mold growing on bread could clean a wound and which roots could ease the pain of a passing soul. She lived on the edge of their world, tolerated when the fever burned hot in a child's brow, but hated the moment the fever broke. Eliza stood, hefting her basket. She had enough for a poultice. As she walked back toward her cabin, the dry grass crunching beneath her worn boots, she felt the weight of the town's gaze even from this distance. It was a physical pressure, like the impending storm that never broke. Later that morning, necessity forced her into town. She needed salt and flour. She hitched her old mule, Barnaby, to the small cart and made the slow ride down the rutted track. The main street of Rook's Hollow was quiet, the heat keeping most indoors. As she tied Barnaby to the rail outside the general store, a group of children playing in the dirt stopped and stared. One of them, a boy with hair the color of straw, whispered loud enough to carry, "She eats frogs." His sister yanked his arm. "Hush," she hissed. "She will curse you." Eliza kept her eyes forward, her spine stiff. She dusted her skirts and stepped onto the boardwalk. 2 women in high-collared dresses, despite the heat, were exiting the store. They saw her and immediately crossed themselves, stepping into the dusty street to avoid passing too close. Eliza nodded to them. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable, Mrs. Vance." They did not reply. They hurried away, clutching their bonnets, as if Eliza carried a contagion that could drift across the air. Inside the store, the air was dim and smelled of sawdust and coffee. Silas, the shopkeeper, wiped the counter with a rag that was grayer than the wood. He did not smile when Eliza approached. 5 pounds of flour. "Silas," Eliza said, placing 2 coins on the counter, "and a sack of salt." Silas took the money without touching her fingers. He weighed the goods in silence, his eyes darting toward the door as if checking to see who might be watching. "Pastor Hale was preaching about you again on Sunday," Silas muttered, sliding the sacks across the scarred wood. Eliza placed the items in her basket. "Is that so? He says the drought is a judgment. Says the land is dying because we tolerate unnatural women in our midst. Says the Lord withholds the rain when his flock strays to dark magic. Eliza met his gaze. Her eyes were a striking, clear hazel, unsettling in their directness. It is a drought. Silas, it rains or it does not. My yarrow plants have nothing to do with the clouds. Silas looked away, looking shameful and small. I am just telling you what he said. Eliza, people are scared. When people get scared, they get mean. You best watch yourself. I always do, she replied. She left the store, the bell above the door jangling with an abrasive cheerfulness that matched nothing else in the town. As she loaded her cart, she saw Pastor Hale standing on the steps of the white clapboard church at the end of the street. He was a tall man, gaunt as a fence post, dressed in black wool that must have been suffocating. He watched her from across the distance, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not wave. He stood like a sentinel, guarding the souls of Rook's Hollow against the woman who knew how to heal them. The summons came 3 days later, in the breathless heat of the afternoon. A ranch hand from the Hargrove estate rode up to her cabin, his horse lathered and blowing hard. He did not dismount. "Foreman's wife is having trouble," the man shouted over the fence. "Baby is stuck. She is bleeding bad." Eliza did not ask for details. She grabbed her leather satchel, which was always packed, and mounted Barnaby. The mule was slow, but he was sure-footed. The Hargrove Ranch was the largest in the valley, a sprawling testament to wealth and power that was slowly withering under the sun. When Eliza arrived, the main house was in chaos. Servants ran with boiling water, and the sound of a woman screaming tore through the thick walls. Mr. Hargrove, the owner, stood on the porch, smoking a cigar with nervous, jerky motions. He eyed Eliza with disdain, but gestured her inside. "Do what you can," he said, "but no tricks." Eliza ignored him and went straight to the back bedroom. The air inside was thick, smelling of copper and stale sweat. The woman, a young girl named Sarah, was pale as milk, her hair plastered to her skull. The local doctor was drunk in the corner, his hands shaking too badly to be of use. Eliza took charge. She washed her hands in the basin, scrubbing until her skin was red. She ordered the windows open to let out the stifling heat. She worked for 3 hours, fighting for 2 lives. Her hands were strong and sure, turning the infant, coaxing it into the world while she fed the mother a tincture of shepherd's purse to stem the flow of blood. When the baby finally cried, a thin, reedy sound, the tension in the room snapped. Sarah collapsed back onto the pillows, alive but exhausted. Eliza cleaned the child and wrapped him in a rough linen cloth. "She is going to be fine," Eliza said, her voice raspy from disuse. "Keep her warm. Give her the tea I left on the table every 4 hours." The ranch hands were clustered in the doorway, peering into the dim room. They saw the blood on Eliza's apron and the green stains on her fingers. Instead of relief, their faces held a dark suspicion. "How did she stop the bleeding?" one whispered. "Roots," another muttered. "Devil's work." Eliza packed her bag, her shoulders aching. She walked past them, head high. They parted for her, but their eyes followed her back, hard and cold as flint. There was no offer of a meal, no money pressed into her hand, just the unspoken demand that she leave before her presence tainted the house any further. The ride back to her cabin was long. The sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the scrubland. Eliza felt a deep, hollow loneliness settle in her chest. She had saved a mother and a son, yet she felt more like a criminal than a savior. She was 3 miles from her cabin, crossing a dry wash filled with tumbling sagebrush. When she saw the horse, it was a roan gelding, standing motionless with its head low, reins trailing in the dust. A dark shape was slumped over its neck. Eliza pulled Barnaby to a halt. "Hello," she called out. The figure did not move. The horse nickered softly, stepping sideways. Eliza dismounted and approached cautiously. The rider was a man, and he looked halfway to the grave. He was tall, his legs long in the stirrups, wearing a duster coat that was stiff with road dirt. She reached up and touched his arm. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and slid sideways. Eliza caught him before he hit the ground, buckling under his dead weight. He was heavy, built of solid muscle and bone, but he felt wasted, as if the heat had cooked the life out of him. She laid him in the meager shade of a mesquite bush. His skin was gray and clammy, burning with fever. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into a few days of dark stubble, but it was the dark stain on his left side that drew her eye. Eliza peeled back the duster. His shirt was stuck to his skin with dried blood. A bullet hole, angry and infected, sat just above his hip bone. "You are in a bad way." "Stranger," she whispered. She looked at the horizon. It was empty. No dust cloud signaled a posse. No riders were cresting the ridge. Whoever had done this was gone, or far behind. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial that tested every ounce of Eliza's strength. She could not lift him onto the horse. Instead, she revived him just enough with a splash of water from her canteen to get him stumbling. He was delirious, his eyes rolling back in his head, mumbling names she did not know. "Walk," she commanded, hooking his arm over her shoulder. "You have to walk." They moved like a two-headed beast, stumbling over rocks and through grasping thorns. Eliza grunted with the effort, her boots slipping on the loose shale. By the time they reached her cabin, the moon was rising, a sliver of bone in the dark sky. She got him through the door and onto her narrow bed. He passed out immediately. Eliza lit the kerosene lamp, the yellow light throwing grotesque shadows against the log walls. She did not rest. There was no time. She stoked the stove, feeding it dry wood until the iron top glowed. She put a pot of water on to boil and laid out her instruments: a sharp paring knife, a pair of silver forceps, a needle, and a spool of silk thread. She cut his shirt away, revealing the wound. The bullet was still inside. The flesh around it was angry red and hot to the touch. Eliza washed the wound with boiled water and a tincture of golden seal. The man thrashed, his body arching off the mattress. "Hold still," Eliza commanded, leaning her weight on his legs. He opened his eyes. They were blue, a startling, vivid blue that seemed to pierce through the delirium. He looked at her, then at the shelves lining the walls. Rows of glass jars filled with dried roots, bundles of sage hanging from the rafters, the mortar and pestle on the table. He looked back at her, his lips peeling back in a grimace that might have been a smile or a snarl. "A witch!" he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "I ride all the way to hell, and I wake up with a witch. I am the woman saving your life," Eliza said, pouring whiskey onto the knife. "Now bite down on this." She shoved a strip of leather between his teeth. He bit down, a groan tearing from his throat as she probed the wound. It was deep. She could feel the metal grating against bone. Eliza worked quickly, her hands steady despite the exhaustion trembling in her legs. She found the slug, clamped the forceps around it, and pulled. With a wet suction sound, the bullet came free. She dropped it into a tin bowl. Clink. Jack, she assumed that was his name, for he had muttered it in his fever, went limp, passing out from the pain. Eliza cleaned the wound again, packed it with a paste of honey and herbs to draw out the infection, and stitched the skin closed. She sat back, wiping her bloodied hands on a rag. The cabin was silent save for the hiss of the lamp and the man's shallow, ragged breathing. She looked at him. He was a dangerous man. She could see it in the calluses on his hands and the way his gun belt, now hanging on the chair, was worn smooth at the holster. She walked to the window and looked out toward the town. The lights of Rook's Hollow flickered in the distance, tiny pinpricks of civilization in the vast, dark emptiness. She knew what they would say if they knew she had a strange man in her bed, a man with a bullet wound. The whispers would turn to shouts. She should have left him on the road. It would have been the safe thing to do. But Eliza looked back at the sleeping cowboy, at the rise and fall of his chest. She had spent her life fighting death. She could not let it win, not even for a stranger who called her names. For 3 days. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness. Eliza slept in the rocking chair, her rifle across her lap. She fed him broth and changed his bandages, watching the red anger of the infection slowly recede. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke up clear-headed, asking for water. He told her his name was Jack. He did not say his last name, and she did not ask. He watched her constantly as he healed, his eyes following her as she ground herbs or swept the floor. He was wary, like a trapped wolf, but there was a curiosity in him. "You live out here all alone?" he asked one evening, his voice stronger. "I do," Eliza said, "shelling peas into a bowl. Town folks don't come around much? Only when they are dying." Jack chuckled, then winced, holding his side. "Seems we have that in common." "Which?" "People only want me around when there is killing to be done." Eliza paused. "My name is Eliza?" Jack looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Eliza," he repeated, testing the weight of the word. "Well, Eliza, you have a steady hand, I will give you that." It was a truce, of sorts. But while the tension inside the cabin eased, the tension outside was pulling tight. The drought did not break. The cattle continued to die. And then, tragedy struck the Miller family. Thomas, the little boy with the straw-colored hair who had taunted Eliza, took a fever. His parents, terrified of the doctor's bill and skeptical of the herbalist, prayed over him for 3 days. By the time they sent for Eliza, the boy was burning up, his throat swollen shut with diphtheria. Eliza had ridden to their house, pushed past the wailing mother, and done everything she could. She used steamers of eucalyptus and poultices of onion, but the sickness had dug its claws in too deep. The boy died in the gray light of dawn, gasping for air that would not come. Mr. Miller, a large man with hands like shovels, had not cried. He had stared at Eliza with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical blow. "You did this," he had whispered. "You and your roots. You cursed him because he laughed at you. I tried to save him," Eliza had said, her voice shaking. "You called me too late. Get out," Miller had roared. "Get out before I kill you." Eliza had fled. Now, 2 days after the boy's death, the grief in Rook's Hollow had curdled into something uglier. Pastor Hale stood at the pulpit, his face running with sweat, and pointed a trembling finger toward the hills. "The Lord is testing us," he bellowed. "He takes the innocent because we harbor the wicked. We suffer the drought because we allow the devil's handmaiden to live on our doorstep. How many more children must die before we cleanse this valley?" The congregation listened. They were hungry, they were broke, and they were grieving. They needed a reason for their suffering, something they could touch and break. God was too far away to blame. Eliza was right there. It was dusk when Eliza saw them. She was outside, chopping wood for the night, when she noticed the dust cloud on the road. It was moving fast. She stood up, shielding her eyes against the dying sun. Jack limped out onto the porch, leaning heavily on the door frame. He was wearing his shirt again, though he left it unbuttoned over the bandage. He followed her gaze. "Company?" he asked quietly. Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I do not think so." The riders drew closer. They were silhouettes against the rust-colored sky, black cutouts of men on horses. She counted 6 of them. As they neared the property line, she recognized the lead rider. It was Mr. Miller. Beside him rode the foreman from the Hargrove Ranch, and 4 other men she knew by face, if not by name. They did not look like men coming for a cure. They carried rifles, and one of them held a torch, the flame sputtering in the wind. Jack stepped off the porch. He moved stiffly, but his hand hovered near the revolver he had strapped back on. "Go inside, Eliza," he said. His voice was completely different now. The teasing edge was gone. It was flat, cold, and deadly. "This is my home," Eliza said, gripping the axe handle. "Not for long," Jack said. "Look at them. They are working themselves up to something." The riders stopped at the edge of the yard, 20 yards out. The horses stomped nervously. Sensing the tension, Miller rode forward. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. "Eliza!" he shouted. "You come out here. I am here. Mr. Miller!" she called back. her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "You killed my boy," Miller screamed, the grief tearing his voice apart. "You poisoned him with your witch weeds. I tried to help him. Eliza said, I grieved for him." "Liar! Pastor Hale says you traded his soul. He says you brought the drought, and now we hear you are harboring a man, a devil to mate with a witch." The Hargrove foreman spat on the ground. "We are done with you, woman. We are done with the bad luck you bring to this valley." Jack stepped forward, placing himself between Eliza and the riders. He looked casual, almost bored, but his body was coiled like a spring. "Gentlemen," Jack said. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly across the yard. "You are upsetting the lady." "Who are you?" the foreman demanded, raising his rifle. "Just a man passing through," Jack said. "A man who thinks you should turn those horses around and go home to your wives." "We ain't going nowhere," Miller said, raising the torch. "We are burning this rot out. We are purifying this land." The torchlight reflected in the eyes of the men. They were not thinking anymore. They were feeling the hot, righteous rush of mob justice. They had found their scapegoat, and they intended to sacrifice her. Eliza looked at the torch, then at her cabin, her drying herbs, her books, her simple, quiet life. She realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that words would not stop this. Jack glanced back at her. "Get behind the water trough. Eliza, now." "Why?" she whispered. "Because," Jack said, drawing his gun with a speed that blurred the eye. "School is in session." Miller threw the torch. It arced through the twilight, trailing sparks, and landed in the dry brush piled against the side of the cabin. The wood, seasoned by years of drought, caught instantly. A tongue of orange flame licked up the wall. Eliza screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of gunfire. Jack fired, not at the men, but into the dirt at the horses' feet. The animals panicked, rearing and bucking. The mob shouted, fighting to stay in their saddles. The fire climbed higher, illuminating the yard in a hellish, flickering glow. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of gunpowder. It has begun, Eliza thought, watching the flames catch the eaves of her roof. Rook's Hollow had finally come for her, and the cowboy standing beside her, framed by the fire, looked ready to welcome them. The night wind had teeth, biting through the chinks in the logs of the cabin, but inside, the air was heavy with a different kind of pressure. Jack had been drifting in the gray space between fever and sleep, the pain in his side a dull, throbbing anchor keeping him from floating away entirely. He heard the sound of hooves before the shouting started, a rhythmic thudding against the hard-packed earth that vibrated up through the floorboards and into the frame of the bed. He forced his eyes open. The room tilted dangerously. The shadows cast by the dying embers in the stove seemed to stretch and grasp at the walls. He was shirtless, the bandage around his ribs stark white against skin that had paled from days indoors, though the center of the linen was stained with fresh red. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his breath hissing through his teeth as the muscles in his abdomen seized. Eliza was already at the door. She stood with her back to him, her posture rigid, her hand hovering near the latch but not touching it. Outside, the voices were rising, a chaotic chorus of male anger that sounded like a pack of dogs treeing a cat. "Open up, witch!" a voice bellowed. It was raw, cracked with grief and fury. Jack recognized the tone. It was the sound of a man who needed someone to bleed for his own pain. Jack swung his legs over the edge of the bed. The floor rushed up to meet him, but he caught himself on the bed frame, sweat instantly slicking his forehead. "Eliza," he rasped. She turned, her face pale in the gloom. "Stay down. Jack, you will tear your stitches. Get away from the door," he warned, his voice gaining a hard edge. Before she could move, a heavy fist hammered against the wood. Dust rained down from the doorframe. "We know you are in there," the voice outside shouted. "You killed my boy. Eliza, you poisoned him with your roots and your devil prayers." Eliza leaned close to the wood, her hands pressed flat against the rough grain as if she could physically hold back the hatred on the other side. "Mr. Miller, please," she called out, her voice trembling but clear. I did everything I could for Thomas. The sickness was too strong. You know I tried to save him. Lies, another voice screamed. Pastor Hale says you cursed the rain away. He says you lay with demons. Jack forced himself to stand. His knees shook, but he locked them. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall near the headboard. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been, but the cold wood of the stock felt familiar, grounding him. Eliza, get away from there, Jack said again, louder this time. They are not here to talk. Open this door or we burn you out, Miller shouted. There was a moment of silence, the kind that comes right before the thunderclap. Then, the sound of glass shattering against the exterior logs. A whoosh of air followed. A sudden, violent intake of breath as fire caught hold. The orange glow flared instantly through the cracks in the walls, painting stripes of light across the cabin floor. The smell of kerosene was sharp and chemical, overpowering the scent of dried sage. They threw a lantern, Eliza whispered, backing away, her eyes wide with horror. Smoke began to curl under the door, thick and gray. The heat rose immediately, turning the small room into an oven. Grab what you can, Jack barked, the adrenaline finally overriding the pain in his side. We have to move. Eliza grabbed a blanket from the chair and began beating at the wall where the flames were licking through, but it was useless. The wood was old and dry as tinder. The fire was eating it alive. The roar of the flames outside grew deafening, drowning out the shouts of the men. The door burst open, not by their hand, but kicked in by a boot. Smoke billowed in, a choking gray cloud. Two men rushed through the haze, their faces covered with bandanas, eyes streaming from the smoke. There she is, one shouted. They lunged for Eliza. She fought, scratching and kicking. But she was small, and they were fueled by a righteous, blinded fury. One of them grabbed her by the hair, dragging her toward the open door. Bring her out, someone yelled from the yard. Find a tree! A proper hanging for a witch! Jack leveled the rifle. The room was spinning. The heat was suffocating, but his vision narrowed to a tunnel. He saw the man's hand on Eliza's arm. He squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot was massive in the confined space. The bullet took a chunk out of the door frame inches from the man's head. The man flinched, releasing Eliza for a fraction of a second, but his partner grabbed her waist and hauled her out into the night. Jack stumbled after them, coughing, the smoke searing his lungs. He hit the cooler air of the yard and nearly fell, but he used the rifle as a crutch, staggering into the firelight. The scene was a nightmare painted in orange and black. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames leaping toward the stars, illuminating the sweating faces of the mob. There were 6 of them on horseback, milling around, while the 2 on the ground dragged Eliza toward the old oak tree that stood by the creek. Let her go, Jack roared. His voice was hoarse, damaged by smoke, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The men on the ground froze. They looked back to see a demon emerging from the fire, a man shirtless, covered in sweat and soot, a bloody bandage wrapped around his midsection, holding a Winchester repeating rifle with a hand that shook but did not waver. Jack worked the lever of the rifle, ejecting the spent shell. The brass casing hit the dirt with a metallic ping. I said, let her go. Who are you? Miller shouted from his horse, his eyes wide. He was holding a length of rope. I am the man who is going to put a hole in your chest if you do not drop her, Jack said. He fired again, not at them, but into the dirt between the boots of the men holding Eliza. The dust kicked up, spattering their trousers. The horses whinnied and danced, terrified by the gunshot and the fire. She is a witch, Miller screamed, pointing a trembling finger. She killed my son. She has to pay. She healed your wife when she was sick last winter. Jack snarled, stepping forward. The pain in his side was a white-hot knife, but he pushed into it, using the agony to fuel his rage. She birthed half the children in this valley. And this is how you repay her, by burning her home, by stringing her up like a cattle rustler. It is God's judgment, the foreman shouted, though he lowered his own pistol slightly, unnerved by Jack's presence. Jack spat on the ground. You would not know God if he stood in front of you. Now back off, all of you. He swung the rifle barrel toward Miller, centering the sights on the man's chest. "I have 5 rounds left in this gun," Jack said softly. "There are 8 of you. I might not get all of you, but I promise you, Miller, you will be the first to drop. You want to see your boy tonight?" The silence that stretched between them was heavy, filled only by the crackling of the burning timber and the sobbing of Eliza, who had fallen to her knees in the dust. Miller stared at Jack. He saw the eyes of a man who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose. The grief in Miller's face warred with fear. Slowly, the fear won. He lowered the rope. "This isn't over," Miller spat, his voice thick with phlegm and hate. "You can't protect her forever, stranger. The devil comes for his own." He wheeled his horse around. "Let her be," Miller shouted to the men on the ground. The 2 men released Eliza, shoving her forward so she fell onto her hands. One of them leaned down, his face twisted in a sneer. "Demon," he hissed. "You burn in hell." He spat on her, a glob of spittle landing on the back of her worn dress. Then they scrambled for their horses, mounting up and tearing off into the darkness, following Miller back toward town. Jack did not lower the rifle until the sound of their hooves had faded into the wind. Only then did the strength go out of him. He sagged, the rifle barrel dipping toward the earth, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The cabin was a lost cause. The roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that drifted up like fireflies, disappearing into the vast, indifferent sky. Eliza was still on her knees, staring at the inferno. Her hands were pressed into the dirt. She was shaking, a violent trembling that had nothing to do with the cold. Jack limped over to her. He dropped the rifle and knelt, wincing as his side screamed in protest. He took her by the shoulders. "Eliza." She did not look at him. She was watching her herb garden wither and blacken in the heat. "My books," she whispered. "My mother's Bible. The seeds I saved for spring." "They are gone," Jack said, his voice gentle now. "We have to go. Eliza, they will come back. Maybe not tonight, but they will come back with more men." She turned to him then, and her face was a mask of soot and tears. "Why?" she cried out, the sound tearing from her throat. "I only ever helped them. I stitched their cuts. I cooled their fevers. I have lived here my whole life. Jack, I have never done harm to a soul. Why do they hate me so much?" Jack pulled her against him. He held her head against his chest, heedless of the blood seeping through his bandage or the sweat on his skin. He rocked her slightly as the heat of the fire beat against their backs. "Because they are scared," he said quietly, looking over the top of her head at the flames. "And because it is easier to hate you than to look at their own failures." "I have nowhere to go," she sobbed. "You are with me," Jack said, "and I am not leaving you." He stood up, pulling her with him. "Come on, we need to move while the fire has their attention." They circled around to the small lean-to shed that stood apart from the cabin. It had escaped the flames, though the air inside was hot and thick with smoke. Jack's horse, a sturdy bay gelding, was stamping nervously. Barnaby, Eliza's mule, was standing with his head down, ears twitching. Jack worked quickly, his movements efficient despite his injury. He saddled the bay and threw a blanket over the mule. "What do we have?" he asked. Eliza wiped her face with her apron. She moved like a sleepwalker, but her hands found a rhythm. "I have my saddlebags," she said. "There are some dried rations in the shed, a few jars of salve I kept out here, a blanket. It will have to be enough," Jack said. He helped her onto the mule. She looked small and fragile perched on the animal's back, her dress torn, her hair wild. He mounted his horse, gritting his teeth as he pulled himself into the saddle. They rode out of the yard, skirting the edge of the firelight. Eliza turned in her saddle to look back. The cabin was just a skeleton of burning logs now. The life she had built, the sanctuary she had carved out of the wilderness, was nothing but ash and memory. They rode in silence for hours, putting miles of scrub and rock between them and Rook's Hollow. The moon climbed high, silvering the sagebrush. The wind died down, leaving a stillness that felt profound and lonely. When the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, they stopped in a dry gully to rest the animals. Jack slid from his horse and nearly collapsed. Eliza was there instantly, her healer's instinct overriding her grief. She helped him sit against a rock, checking his bandage. It was soaked through. "You are bleeding again," she said, her fingers gentle on the linen. "I will live," Jack said, closing his eyes. Eliza sat back on her heels, looking at him. "Who are you?" "Jack," she asked. "Really?" He opened his eyes. They were lighter in the dawn, the color of washed-out denim. "I told you, just a drifter. A drifter does not stare down a lynch mob with 5 bullets," she said. "A drifter does not shoot the dirt off a man's boots from 30 yards. Jack sighed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pouch of tobacco, rolling a cigarette with one hand. "My name is Jack Thorne." Eliza watched him. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested it should have. "I killed a man in Abilene," Jack said, striking a match on his boot. "He was the son of a cattle baron, a man named Sterling." "Was it a fair fight?" Eliza asked. "He drew his gun first," Jack said, watching the smoke curl into the air. "But his father did not see it that way. He put a price on my head. $500. I have been running for 2 years. He looked at her. "That is why I cannot stay. Eliza, I bring trouble just by breathing. If I had stayed in Rook's Hollow, that posse would have found out who I was eventually. They would have burned you out just to get to me." Eliza looked down at her hands. They were stained with soot. "So we are both fugitives," she said softly. "One witch, one murderer." Jack reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused from reins and rope. "I did not murder him?" "Eliza, but the world does not care about the difference. We cannot go back," she said, stating the fact that had been hanging over them. "No," Jack said. "We head west, over the mountains. There is country out there where the law does not reach." They rested for an hour, then mounted up again. The days that followed were a blur of heat and dust. They rode through a landscape that seemed stripped of mercy. The plains were vast and sun-hammered, stretching out flat and brown in every direction. The waterholes were muddy dregs that smelled of alkali. They spoke little during the day, the sun stealing the moisture from their tongues. But at night, huddled by small fires made of twisted sagewood, the silence began to break. Eliza spoke of her childhood. She told him of the old woman, weary and kind, who had found her abandoned on the steps of a church in St. Louis and taken her in. "She taught me that the earth provides," Eliza said, staring into the flames one night. "She taught me that every leaf has a purpose. She said people fear what they cannot control, and they cannot control nature. So they fear those who understand it." Jack listened, whittling a piece of cedar. "My father was a preacher," he said suddenly. "A hard man. He believed the only way to save a soul was to beat the sin out of the body. I left when I was 15. Never looked back." He tossed the wood into the fire. "I have spent my life moving, Eliza, working ranch to ranch. I thought if I kept moving, the past could not catch me. But it always does. That boy in Abilene, I see his face when I sleep. He was scared. Just a kid trying to prove he was a man. I did not want to kill him." Eliza looked at him across the fire. She saw the lines of fatigue etched into his face, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "You saved me, Jack," she said. "You could have ridden on. You could have let them take me." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I could not watch another innocent thing burn." The bond between them grew in those quiet hours. It was forged in the shared canteen, the way Jack checked the cinch on her saddle every morning, the way Eliza brewed willow bark tea for his pain every night. They were two broken things trying to hold each other together. 5 days out from Rook's Hollow, the weather turned, the heat broke, replaced by a cold front sweeping down from the north. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the distant peaks. They camped in the lee of a large boulder, trying to escape the biting wind. They had only the one blanket Eliza had salvaged. Jack spread it out on the hard ground. "We will freeze if we sleep apart," he said, his voice practical but with a slight hesitation. Eliza nodded. "I know." They lay down, pulling the worn wool over them. It was a tight fit. Jack lay on his back, stiff, trying to give her space. Eliza lay on her side, facing him. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on them. Eliza shifted, moving closer until her back pressed against his side. She could feel the heat radiating from him. Jack stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. He turned onto his side, facing her. In the dark, their faces were inches apart. Eliza could see the glint of his eyes, the curve of his scar. "Are you cold?" he whispered. "Yes," she said. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air between them. Then, slowly, he rested it on her waist. It was a tentative touch, gentle and questioning. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She moved closer, closing the last inch of distance. Her hand came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong, steady, alive. "Jack," she breathed. He leaned in. The kiss was slow at first, a brush of lips, dry and chapped from the wind. It was a question asked and answered in the dark. "Are we allowed this?" "Yes." Then the urgency took over. Jack's arm tightened around her, pulling her flush against him. Eliza's fingers tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate, a way to forget the burning cabin, the lynch mob, the hunger, and the cold. It was not just desire. It was a reclaiming. The world had tried to destroy them, to burn them out and hunt them down. But here, under a scrap of wool in the middle of nowhere, they were alive. They were warm. Jack pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I have nothing to give you, no home, no money, just a price on my head." Eliza ran her thumb over the scar on his jaw. "You are here," she said. "That is all I need." They clung to each other as the wind rattled the sagebrush outside their small shelter. For the first time in years, Eliza did not feel the crushing weight of loneliness. She felt safe, and as the cold night deepened, they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. Two outcasts finding a home in the only place left to them, each other. The valley of Cedar Crossing appeared like a hallucination born of heat stroke and desperation. To eyes accustomed to the blinding white of alkali flats and the relentless gray of sagebrush, the green that lined the river bottom was a shock. Cottonwood trees, thick-trunked and ancient, leaned over the water, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the breeze. The grass here was not the brittle straw of the high plains, but a living, breathing carpet that promised softness. Eliza pulled her mule, Barnaby, to a halt on the ridge overlooking the town. Beside her, Jack sat slumped in his saddle, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield his eyes. They were coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like a second skin. Their lips were cracked, their canteens dry since mid-morning. "It looks real," Jack rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "It is real," Eliza said. "I can smell the water." They rode down the switchback trail in silence, the air growing cooler as they descended. The town itself was modest, a collection of timber buildings strung along a wide, dirt main street. There was a general store with a false front, a livery stable that smelled of sweet hay, and a small white church with a steeple that seemed to prick the blue sky, unlike Rook's Hollow, which had felt like a place dying by inches. Cedar Crossing had a pulse. A blacksmith's hammer rang out. Clang, clang, clang. A steady heartbeat of industry. They watered the animals at the public trough, the horses drinking with deep, desperate gulps. Eliza splashed water on her face, groaning as the coolness hit her sunburned skin. She looked at Jack. He was watching the street, his eyes scanning every window and doorway. The habit of the hunted. "We need names," Jack said quietly, leaning against his horse's flank. "If we are staying, we cannot be the witch and the gunman." "I am Eliza," she said firmly. "That is the one thing I will not give up. But for the rest—" She looked at the brass ring on the harness of the mule. "Cordell," she said, "Eliza Cordell, and you are my husband, Jack Cordell." Jack tested the name on his tongue. It tasted strange, heavy with a domesticity he had never known. "Jack Cordell," he repeated. Sounds like a man who pays his taxes and sleeps through the night. That is the point, Eliza said. They found a room to let above the general store, a space scarcely larger than a closet, with a slanted ceiling and a single window that looked out over the alley. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins with flour on her apron, eyed them with curiosity but took Jack's last few coins without complaint. "You two look like you walked out of the Badlands," she noted, handing them a brass key. "We had a run of bad luck in the territories," Jack said, his voice smooth. "Practicing the lie? Looking for a fresh start?" Mrs. Higgins nodded. "Well, Cedar Crossing is a good place for that. As long as you work hard and keep your nose clean, nobody asks too many questions." For the first few weeks, that seemed to be the truth. Jack found work at the Double Bar Ranch, 5 miles east of town. It was owned by a man named Mr. Abernathy, a rancher who cared more about a man's ability to dig a post hole than his history. The work was brutal. The ground here was stony, resisting every strike of the shovel, and the wire fencing tore at Jack's hands until his gloves were shredded. But Jack welcomed the pain. It was clean pain. It was simple. There was no moral ambiguity in fixing a fence. You pulled the wire tight, you drove the staple, and the line held. It was a penance he could understand. Eliza, meanwhile, moved with the caution of a feral cat entering a new house. She did not hang a sign. She did not advertise. She simply made herself useful. She frequented the mercantile, listening to the gossip of the women. When she heard Mrs. Gable complaining of a toothache that clove oil would not touch, Eliza quietly pressed a small jar of willow bark and arnica into her hand. "Just a family remedy," Eliza whispered. "Chew on the root, then apply the salve." When Mrs. Gable's pain vanished by the next morning, word began to trickle out. Eliza was careful. She never used the word healer and certainly never herbalist. She was just a woman who knew a few old tricks from her grandmother. The real test came a month after their arrival. The local physician, Dr. Finch, was a man of 60 who looked 80. He was stooped and gray, his hands trembling with a palsy that he tried to hide in deep pockets. He was overwhelmed. The only doctor for 40 miles. Eliza was in the mercantile buying thread when the doctor's boy burst in, eyes wide. "Dr. Finch needs help," he shouted. "Mrs. Sutton is having the baby, and it is going wrong." The shop fell silent. Mrs. Sutton was the baker's wife, a woman well loved in the town. Eliza did not think. The instinct that had driven her for 10 years took over. She dropped her basket and followed the boy, running down the boardwalk to the small clinic at the edge of town. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Mrs. Sutton was thrashing on the bed, her face a mask of terror. Dr. Finch stood by the foot of the bed, pale and sweating, his hands shaking violently. "It is a breach," he muttered, panic edging his voice. "The leg is down. I cannot turn it." Eliza stepped to the basin, scrubbing her hands with lye soap until they stung. She moved past the doctor, her presence commanding in the small room. "Step aside. Doctor," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it had the weight of iron. "Who are you?" Finch stammered. "I am the one who is going to save this baby," Eliza said. She moved to the bedside. She did not chant. She did not offer prayers. She placed her hands on Mrs. Sutton's abdomen, feeling the position of the child. It was locked, twisted. "Mrs. Sutton, look at me," Eliza commanded. The woman's eyes, wild with pain, locked onto Eliza's face. "I need you to stop screaming and listen. We have to work together. When I tell you to push, you push, not before. Do you understand?" Mrs. Sutton nodded, a sob catching in her throat. Eliza worked with a terrifying focus. She reached in, her fingers searching for the child's hip. The room was silent save for the ragged breathing of the mother and the ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a battle of leverage and anatomy. Eliza manipulated the infant, sweat dripping from her nose, her arms trembling with the effort. "Now," Eliza said. "Push, Mrs." Sutton screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the thin timber walls. Eliza guided the child, twisting, pulling, one shoulder, then the other. With a wet rush, the baby slid free. Eliza caught him, a boy, blue and silent, Dr. Finch gasped. "He is dead." Eliza ignored him. She cleared the mucus from the infant's mouth with her pinky finger and rubbed his back vigorously with a rough towel. "Breathe," she whispered fiercely. "Breathe." The baby arched his back and let out a wail that sounded like the sweetest music in the world. Color flooded his skin, turning from blue to angry pink. Eliza wrapped him in a blanket and handed him to his mother. Only then did she step back, her knees suddenly feeling like water. Dr. Finch stared at her. He looked at her bloodied hands, then at her face. He saw the intelligence there, the practice. "You have done this before, Mrs. Cordell," Finch said. "Once or twice," Eliza replied. Leaning against the wall, Finch wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He did not ask where she learned it. He simply nodded. "I have a surgery tomorrow. A man with a crushed foot. I could use a steady hand to hold the ether." It was an invitation. It was acceptance. Life settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously like happiness. Jack rose every morning before the sun, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He would drink the coffee Eliza had left on the stove, black and bitter, before riding out. The landscape of Cedar Crossing was less violent than the territory they had fled. The hills were rolling rather than jagged, covered in scrub oak and juniper, as Jack rode the fence line, stretching barbed wire until it sang in the wind. He found his mind quieting. The constant vigilance that had defined his life, the need to watch every shadow, to sit with his back to the wall, began to ease. Here, he was just a man fixing a fence. His hands, once known for the speed of his draw, were now covered in cuts and calluses, stained with grease and dirt. He liked the ache in his muscles when he rode back to town at dusk. It felt honest. Evenings were their sanctuary. The room above the general store was hot in the summer, but they kept the window open to catch the river breeze. When Jack came through the door, smelling of horse sweat and dust, Eliza would be there. She would have a basin of warm water waiting. Jack would strip off his shirt, his skin bronzed by the sun. The scar on his side a jagged white reminder of the bullet Eliza had pulled from him. He would sit on the edge of the bed, head bowed, while Eliza took a damp cloth and washed his back. It was a ritual of intimacy that went deeper than words. She would trace the muscles of his shoulders, washing away the day's labor. Jack would close his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You worked hard today," she would murmur, the cloth moving over his skin. The south pasture needed turning. Jack would reply, his voice rumbling in his chest. She would move around to face him, drying his chest, her fingers lingering on the scar. Jack would catch her wrist, bringing her palm to his lips. He would kiss the center of her hand, then her wrist, then the soft skin of her inner arm. "Eliza," he would whisper. There was a hunger in them both, a need to affirm that they were still alive, still whole. They would fall back onto the narrow mattress, the springs groaning in protest. Their love-making was not frantic, as it had been on the run. It was slow, deliberate, a conversation of bodies. In the dim light, with the sounds of the town settling below them, they belonged only to each other. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets, they dared to talk about the future. "Mr. Abernathy is looking to sell a parcel of land up near the creek," Jack said one night, staring at the ceiling. 40 acres, good water." Eliza rested her head on his shoulder. 40 acres, she repeated dreamily. "I could have a real garden, not just pots in a window. I could grow sage and echinacea, maybe apple trees. It would take us 2 years to save the money," Jack said. "If we scrape, we can scrape," Eliza said. "We are good at scraping." A silence stretched between them, comfortable and warm. "Do you think we can have it, Jack?" Eliza asked softly. "A life where no one knows? Where I am just Eliza and you are just Jack?" Jack pulled her closer, his chin resting on her hair. "We are making it, aren't we? Nobody here looks at you sideways. Dr. Finch respects you. We are just folks. But fear is a seed that lies dormant for years, waiting for a drop of water." The summer waned, turning the cottonwoods to gold. The air grew crisp, and then the past arrived on a buckboard wagon. He was a trader, a man who dealt in pots, pans, and news from the territories. He set up his wagon in the square, selling tin cups and ribbons. Eliza was walking past, a basket of late-season berries in her hand. When she felt eyes on her, she turned. The trader was watching her. He was a balding man with a weasel's face, familiar in a way that made her blood run cold. She had seen him in Rook's Hollow, drinking on the porch of the saloon, laughing with the men who had later burned her cabin. He did not say anything. He just chewed on a toothpick, his eyes narrowing as he tracked her movement. Eliza forced herself to keep walking, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned the corner and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Later that evening, Jack went to the saloon for a whiskey. It was a Friday habit, a way to show his face and be part of the town. The saloon was noisy, filled with smoke and piano music. Jack stood at the bar, nursing his drink. He saw the trader in the mirror. The man was talking to a group of locals, gesturing with his hands. He pointed toward the door where Jack had just entered. Jack went still. He watched the reflection. The trader whispered something, and the locals turned to look at Jack. Their expressions were not hostile, not yet, but they were curious. Assessing. Jack finished his whiskey in one swallow. He placed the glass down, clack, and walked out. He felt their eyes boring into his back. His hand drifted to his hip, hovering near the Colt he kept hidden under his coat. When he got back to the room, Eliza was waiting, pale and tense. "He saw me," she said. "The man with the wagon." "He saw me too," Jack said grimly. "We should leave," Eliza said, grabbing her shawl. "Tonight?" Jack shook his head. "And go where? Winter is coming. The passes will be snowed in. If we run now, we admit guilt. Maybe he is just talking. Maybe he is not sure, but the poison had been introduced, unbeknownst to them." Another thread was tightening. The mail coach had arrived that afternoon, carrying a bundle of letters. One of them was addressed to the Reverend Obadiah Cole, the pastor of Cedar Crossing. Reverend Cole was a man of sharp angles and absolute certainties. He was tall, thin, and possessed a voice that could peel paint. He believed that joy was a suspect emotion and that control was the highest form of godliness. He sat in his study, the oil lamp casting long shadows, and broke the seal on the letter. It was from a colleague in the South, Pastor Hale of Rook's Hollow, Brother Cole. The letter read, the handwriting spidery and angry. "I write to warn you of a darkness that may have fled my parish and sought refuge in yours. A woman, a harlot and a witch, who communes with the devil and brings ruin to God's crop. She travels with a gunman, a killer of men. They burned my town. They are deceivers. Watch for them." Cole read the letter twice. He folded it precisely and placed it in his Bible. He did not shout. He did not run into the street. He simply smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of lips. He had been looking for a cause. His congregation had been growing complacent, too comfortable in their prosperity. They needed a wolf to make them appreciate the shepherd. The turn happened fast. It started with the whispers. When Eliza walked down the street, conversations would stop. Women she had helped, Mrs. Sutton, Mrs. Gable, would suddenly find something interesting to look at in the opposite direction. They did not cross themselves yet, but they pulled their children closer. At the ranch, the other hand stopped eating lunch with Jack. They sat a few yards away, murmuring. When Jack approached, they would fall silent. "They know something," Jack told Eliza one night. "The air has changed." Then came the storm. It was a freak autumn tempest, dry lightning cracking across the sky with no rain to follow. A bolt struck the roof of the livery stable's hay barn on the edge of town. The dry hay went up like a torch. The town turned out to fight it. Jack was there, throwing buckets of water, his face blackened by soot, working harder than any man on the line. Eliza was there too, tending to the men who suffered burns, bandaging arms and flushing eyes, but gratitude was absent. As the barn burned down to its foundation, leaving a charred scar on the earth, Reverend Cole stood on a crate near the fire wagon. The flames illuminated his gaunt face, making him look like an Old Testament prophet. "Behold," Cole shouted, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "The Lord sends fire to cleanse. Why does he strike us now? We have been a righteous town." He paused, letting the question hang. Or have we? Have we allowed wolves into the fold? Have we let evil wear a gentle face and call itself a healer? The crowd went still. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Eliza, who was kneeling in the dirt, wrapping a bandage around a boy's arm. She froze. "The devil does not always come with horns," Cole roared. "Sometimes he comes with herbs. Sometimes he comes with a gun hidden in his coat. Misfortune follows the wicked. My friends, and since the strangers arrived, have we not felt a darkening?" Jack dropped his bucket. He moved to Eliza's side, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was a protective gesture, but to the crowd, it looked like confirmation. The witch and her guardian. "We helped save your barn," Jack shouted back at the preacher. "We have worked your land. We have birthed your babies. And who gave that woman the power over life and death?" Cole countered, his fingers stabbing the air. Was it God? Or was it something else? A murmur went through the crowd. It was the same sound Jack had heard in Rook's Hollow, the sound of fear looking for a target. "Let's go," Jack whispered to Eliza. They walked away from the fire, back toward their room. The crowd parted for them, but this time there was no space of respect. It was a space of revulsion. Back in the room, Jack checked the load in his revolver. He spun the cylinder. Click, click, click. "It is happening again," Eliza said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her voice was hollow. "We cannot outrun it. Jack." Jack looked out the window. The fire was dying down, but the town was still awake. He could see groups of men talking on the corners. "We are not running this time," Jack said. His face was hard. The peaceful man of the last few months vanishing behind the mask of the gunfighter. "If we run, they will hunt us down in the snow. We die if we leave. We might die if we stay," Eliza said. "Then we make it expensive for them," Jack said. The next day, the isolation was total. Dr. Finch told Eliza, with his eyes fixed on his boots, that he no longer required her assistance. "Mr." Abernathy told Jack that there was no more fence to fix, handing him his wages with a grimace of apology. "It is not me, Jack," the rancher said, "but the men, they are spooked. They say your woman cursed the barn. I cannot have a mutiny. Jack took the money. She is not a witch. Abernathy. She is just a woman." Abernathy spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Doesn't matter what is true, son. Matters what people believe. You best watch your back. Reverend Cole has the sheriff's ear, and the sheriff is a man who likes to keep the peace, no matter who he has to hang to do it." Jack walked back to town. The wind was picking up, blowing dust devils down the main street. He felt the eyes on him, from the windows, from the alleyways. He walked down the center of the road, his hand resting on his gun belt. He was done hiding. If Cedar Crossing wanted a monster, he would show them one, but he would not let them touch Eliza. Not this time. In the small room, Eliza packed her bag, just in case. She looked at the jar of dried lavender on the windowsill, the only piece of home she had tried to make. She crushed a sprig between her fingers. Inhaling the scent, it smelled of peace, but outside, the wind smelled of smoke and brimstone. The fuse was lit. It was only a matter of time before the explosion. The wind changed direction on a Tuesday, blowing down from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Range and carrying a chill that settled in the marrow. It was the kind of wind that made horses skittish and men sullen, rattling the loose boards of the storefronts in Cedar Crossing, near the river, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the bank fell away into a steep, rocky ravine. Samuel Talbot was playing. He was the only son of Jebediah Talbot, a rancher who owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land and walked with the heavy, boot-stomping stride of a man who believed he owned the very dirt beneath him. Samuel was 10 years old, a boy with bright eyes and a penchant for climbing things he ought not to. Eliza was nearby, gathering late-season hips from the wild roses that choked the riverbank. Jack was a mile off, repairing a breach in the pasture fence, his hammer ringing against the staples. The sound of the fall was sickeningly distinct, a scuff of boot leather on shale, a sharp cry, and then the wet, Heavy thud of a body hitting stone. Eliza dropped her basket. She scrambled down the embankment, her skirts tearing on the briars. At the bottom, lying twisted among the river rocks, Samuel lay still. His leg was bent at an angle that turned Eliza's stomach, but it was the blood matting his hair that frightened her more. "Samuel!" Eliza cried, dropping to her knees in the mud. The boy's eyes were open but unfocused. His breath came in shallow, bubbling gasps. Eliza shouted for help, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. She stripped off her petticoat, tearing the fabric into strips to bind the boy's head. His skull was fractured. She could feel the depression beneath the skin. Jack heard the scream on the wind. He did not hesitate. He dropped his tools, vaulted onto his horse, and rode hard toward the river. When he arrived, sliding down the slope in a cloud of dust, he found Eliza pressing the white cloth to the boy's head, her own face pale and set in a mask of desperate concentration. "He is bad off." "Jack," Eliza said, not looking up. "The doctor is in Pine Bluff until Thursday. We have to move him." Jack knelt, his large hands hovering over the small, broken body. "If we move him, we might kill him," Jack said. "If we leave him here, the cold will take him," Eliza countered. "Help me." Jack scooped the boy up. Samuel was light, terribly light, but he felt dead weight in Jack's arms. They climbed the embankment, Jack's boots slipping on the slick rocks, his muscles burning as he fought to keep the boy steady. They laid him in the back of Eliza's small cart, and Jack drove the team, whipping the mule into a run toward the Talbot Ranch. The scene at the ranch house was a portrait of hysteria. Mrs. Talbot collapsed on the porch when she saw Jack carrying her son. Jebediah Talbot stood in the doorway, his face turning the color of raw beef. "What did you do?" Talbot roared, rushing forward. "What did you do to him?" "He fell," Jack said, his voice tight. "Down by the river. We brought him as fast as we could." Eliza pushed past the shouting men. "Get me hot water and clean linens," she ordered, "and whiskey. Now!" For 6 hours, the ranch house was a battleground. Eliza worked over the boy on the dining table. She set the leg, the sound of the bone grating making the ranch hands turn away. She stitched the scalp. She brewed a strong tea of willow and valerian to ease the pain, forcing it drop by drop between the boy's blue lips. Jebediah Talbot paced the room like a caged bear, watching Eliza's every move with suspicion. Reverend Cole arrived within the hour, summoned by a terrified servant. He stood in the corner, black Bible clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on Eliza's green-stained fingers. "Is he going to live?" Talbot demanded, grabbing Eliza's arm as she stepped back to wipe sweat from her eyes. Eliza looked at him. She saw the fear, but she also saw the anger, ready to strike out. "The injury to his head is deep. Mr. Talbot, I have done what I can. Now we must wait." They waited through the long night. The wind howled outside, slapping the shutters against the house. Jack stood on the porch, smoking cigarette after cigarette, his hand resting on his gun. He could feel the tension inside the house radiating out like heat from a stove. Just before dawn, Samuel's breathing changed. The hitching rattle stopped. He let out a long, soft sigh, and then he was gone. "Mrs." Talbot's scream shattered the stillness. Eliza bowed her head, her hands trembling. She reached out to close the boy's eyes. "Don't you touch him!" Talbot screamed. He shoved Eliza hard. She stumbled back, hitting the wall. Jack was through the door in a second, his body interposing itself between Talbot and Eliza. "Back off," Jack warned, his voice low and dangerous. "She killed him." Talbot wept, pointing a shaking finger at Eliza. He was breathing until she touched him. She put her hexes on him. He fell 40 feet onto rock. "Mr. Talbot," Jack said. She tried to save him. Reverend Cole stepped forward from the shadows. The lamplight caught the hard planes of his face. "Did she save him?" Cole asked softly. "Or did she ensure the darkness took him?" Eliza looked at the preacher. "I cleaned his wounds. Reverend, I set his bone. You practiced your arts on a Christian boy," Cole said, his voice rising. "And now he is dead. Darkness invites darkness. Mrs. Cordell, you brought death into this house. Jack grabbed Eliza's arm. "We are leaving." They walked out into the cold gray dawn. Behind them, the sound of misses. Talbot's weeping was a jagged saw cutting through the air. Talbot stood on the porch, watching them ride away, his eyes dead and cold as stones. The funeral was 3 days later. The entire town of Cedar Crossing turned out, dressed in black wool, standing in the biting wind of the cemetery. Eliza and Jack did not attend. They watched from their window above the general store. They saw the way the townspeople looked up at their room, not with pity, but with a unified, terrifying glare. That night, Reverend Cole visited the Talbot ranch. He sat in the parlor, drinking Talbot's brandy, and spoke in low, measured tones. "It is not just a tragedy, Jebediah," Cole said. "It is a sign. The drought followed her in Rook's Hollow. Sickness followed her here. She is a vessel for the unholy." "And the man?" Talbot asked, staring into the fire. "A man of blood," Cole said. "I have made inquiries. He fits the description of a gunman named Thorne who murdered a boy in Abilene. They are two of a kind, a witch and a killer. The poison took hold." In the week that followed, the town of Cedar Crossing began to curdle. It started with the mishaps. A dairy cow belonging to the Smith was found dead in a ravine, its neck broken. A fire broke out in a grain silo on the edge of town, quickly doused, but unexplained. A horse spooked on Main Street, throwing its rider and breaking the man's collarbone. In any other year, these would have been the random cruelties of the frontier, but Reverend Cole had given the town a lens through which to view them. "From the pulpit on Sunday," Cole thundered, "the Lord withdraws his protection when we harbor the wicked. Do you see the signs? The cattle die, the fires burn, the children fall. We are being tested." Jack felt the change in the saloon. He walked in on a Thursday evening to buy a bottle of whiskey. The piano player stopped mid-song. The men at the poker tables laid down their cards. A stranger was sitting at the bar, a man Jack did not know, wearing a dusty bowler hat. He turned to look at Jack. "You walk heavy for a fence mender," the stranger said. Jack ignored him, placing a coin on the bar. "Bottle of rye." The bartender, a man named Pete who had once joked with Jack about the weather, slid the bottle across the wood without looking him in the eye. The stranger in the bowler hat swirled his drink. "I heard a story about a fella looked just like you," the stranger said to the room. "Back in Kansas. Name of Thorne. Fast with a gun. Real fast. Killed a rich man's son and ran like a dog." Jack turned slowly. His hand did not move to his gun, but the threat was there in the stillness of his shoulders. "Kansas is a long way off." "Friend, is it?" The stranger smiled. "Seems like the past has a way of riding faster than a horse. That bounty is up to $800 now. That is a lot of money for a fence mender." Jack stared at him until the stranger's smile faltered. Then he took his bottle and walked out. But he knew the damage was done. His anonymity was gone. He was no longer Jack Cordell. He was Jack Thorne, the hunted man. He climbed the stairs to the room. Eliza was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked small, diminished by the weight of the town's hatred. "We have to go. Jack," she said as soon as he entered. Jack set the bottle down. He sat heavily in the chair, running a hand over his face. "And go where?" "Eliza, the mountains are capping with snow. We would freeze before we made the pass. Better to freeze than to hang," she whispered. "I am tired of running," Jack said, his voice cracking with a sudden, raw exhaustion. "I ran from Abilene. I ran from Rook's Hollow. If we run now, we run forever. We become ghosts." "I'm already a ghost to them," Eliza cried. "Did you see Mrs. Gable today? She crossed the street to avoid my shadow. They think I killed that boy. Jack, they think I pushed him. Let them think it." Jack snapped. "I will not be driven out by a preacher and a grief-mad rancher." "We have done nothing wrong." Eliza stood up, her anger flaring. "Right and wrong do not matter here. Only power matters. And they have it. I have this," Jack said, tapping the revolver on his hip. "And when they come with 10 guns, or 20, will you kill them all? Will you make me watch you become the butcher they say you are?" Jack looked at her, and the fight drained out of him. He saw the terror in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. She was afraid of what he would have to become to save them. "I am scared too. Eliza," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am terrified that if we leave, I will never be able to stop looking over my shoulder. I wanted a life here. With you." Eliza crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his rough hands in hers. "We have a life, Jack, as long as we are breathing. But we won't be breathing long if we stay in Cedar Crossing." Jack pulled her close, burying his face in her neck. "Give me 2 days," he said. "I need to collect my wages from Abernathy. We need supplies. Then we go." But 2 days was too long. In the back room of the sheriff's office, a plan was being hatched. Sheriff Miller, a cousin of the man from Rook's Hollow, a coincidence that felt like fate, sat with his boots on the desk. Jebediah Talbot paced the floor. Reverend Cole sat in the corner, cleaning his spectacles. "We cannot just hang them," the sheriff said. "Not without proof. The territory marshal is due next month. I need cause." "Cause?" Talbot spat. "My son is dead." "Tragic," Cole said smoothly, "but not illegal. However, if they were to be caught in an act of malice against the town, say, arson?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Arson. There have been fires," Cole said. "The people are already afraid. If we were to find evidence at the site of the next fire, perhaps a jar of that witch's oil, some of her distinct herbs. And if Jack Thorne was seen near the place," Talbot added, his eyes gleaming. The sheriff chewed his lip. "You want me to frame them? I want you to do God's work," Cole said. "We are excising a cancer. Sheriff, sometimes the surgeon must cut deep to save the patient." The conspiracy was set, but there was a loose thread. The next evening, a knock came at the door of the room above the general store. Jack drew his gun instantly, signaling Eliza to stand behind the wardrobe. "Who is it?" Jack called. A woman's voice, old and cracked, replied, "A friend. Or at least, I used to be." Eliza gasped. She knew that voice. She ran to the door and through the bolt. Mrs. Dugan stood in the hallway. She was wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face lined with the map of a hard life. She was a widow from Rook's Hollow, the woman whose husband Eliza had eased into death with poppy tea 3 years ago. "Mrs. Dugan?" Eliza said, pulling her inside. "What are you doing here?" "I heard the stories," the old woman said, breathless from the stairs. "Peddlers talk. They said a healer woman and a tall cowboy were in Cedar Crossing. I had to come." "Why?" Jack asked, holstering his gun but not relaxing. "To tell you to run, Mrs. Dugan said, grabbing Eliza's hands. "I work in the kitchen at the Talbot Ranch now. I wash the floors. People don't see an old woman scrubbing the boards. They talk like I ain't there." "What did you hear?" Eliza asked. "I heard Talbot and the preacher." "Mrs. Dugan said, "they are fixing to burn the schoolhouse tonight. Just a small fire, enough to scare folks. And they are going to plant your things there. Eliza, your jars. They are going to say you did it. They want to hang you both." Jack swore softly. "Tonight? Yes, Mrs. Dugan said. "You have to go now, before the sun sets." "Thank you, Mrs. Dugan," Eliza said, tears welling in her eyes. "You risked everything to come here. You saved my Henry from pain at the end." "Mrs. Dugan said fiercely. "I don't forget." She turned to leave. "I have to get back before they notice I am gone." "Go, now!" She hurried out, her footsteps fading down the stairs. Jack grabbed his saddlebags. "She is right. We leave now. No waiting for wages." They packed frantically, shoving clothes and ammunition into the leather bags. It took them 10 minutes. They were just buckling the straps when a scream tore through the evening air. It was a high, thin sound of absolute terror. Cut short. Jack moved to the window, down the street, near the edge of town where the rocky slope fell away to the creek bed. A crowd was gathering. "Stay here," Jack said. He ran down the stairs and out onto the boardwalk. He pushed his way through the gathering knots of people. At the bottom of the ravine, illuminated by a lantern, lay a body. It was Mrs. Dugan. Her neck was twisted at an impossible angle. Sheriff Miller was standing over her, shaking his head. "Poor old woman," the sheriff said loudly. For the benefit of the crowd, must have slipped in the dark. Tragic accident. Jack looked closer. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the mud on the back of Mrs. Dugan's dress. He could see the bruising on her arms, the marks of fingers, heavy fingers. She didn't fall, Jack realized with a cold shock. She was thrown. They had seen her coming to the room. They knew she had warned them. Jack turned and ran back to the room. He burst in, his face pale. They killed her. Eliza. They killed Mrs. Dugan. Eliza froze, a shirt in her hands. What? They threw her down the ravine, and they are calling it an accident. Eliza dropped the shirt. A sound came out of her, a low keen of grief that instantly hardened into something else, something brittle and sharp. She came to save us, Eliza whispered. And they killed her like a dog. We are leaving, Jack said, grabbing her arm. Now. But they were too late. Heavy footsteps pounded on the stairs. The door burst open. Sheriff Miller stood there, his gun drawn. Behind him were 3 deputies and Jebediah Talbot. Jack Cordell, or Jack Thorne, or whatever you call yourself, the sheriff said. Drop the gun belt. Jack's hand hovered over his Colt. He could draw. He could kill the sheriff and Talbot before they blinked, but the deputies had shotguns leveled at Eliza. Don't do it. Jack, the sheriff said, seeing the calculation in his eyes, you move, and the woman gets cut in half. Jack slowly raised his hands. You are making a mistake, Sheriff. The mistake was yours, coming to my town. Talbot sneered. They surged forward. 2 deputies grabbed Jack, slamming him against the wall. They hit him hard. The butt of a shotgun connected with his temple, sending him to his knees. A boot caught him in the ribs, reopening his old wound. Blood bloomed on his shirt. Eliza screamed and lunged for him, but Talbot caught her by the hair. You witch, Talbot hissed. We found the oil at the schoolhouse. We know what you were planning. Liar, Eliza shrieked, clawing at his face. You murderer, you killed Mrs. Dugan, Talbot slapped her, a crack that silenced the room. Get them out of here, the sheriff ordered. They dragged them down the stairs and into the street. The town had gathered. The fire at the schoolhouse, a small, controlled blaze set by Talbot's men, was already out. But the evidence had been found. The crowd was a living thing, a beast with 100 mouths. As Jack was dragged through the dust, blood running into his eyes, he saw the faces of men he had worked with. They looked at him with hatred. Killer! Someone shouted. A rock flew from the darkness, striking Eliza on the shoulder. She stumbled, but the deputies hauled her up, dragging her like a sack of grain. Burn the witch, a woman screamed. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman whose toothache Eliza had cured. They reached the jailhouse, a stone building with iron bars on the windows. They threw Jack into the cell on the left and Eliza into the cell on the right. The heavy iron doors slammed shut. Clang, clang, final as coffins. The sheriff stood in the corridor, wiping his hands. Judge is coming in 3 days, he said. Until then, you rot. He turned down the lantern and walked out, locking the outer door. The darkness in the jail was thick and cold. Jack lay on the cot, his head swimming. He touched his ribs. They were broken. He could feel the bone grinding. He spat blood onto the floor. Eliza, he rasped. Jack! Her voice was small, coming from the darkness across the narrow corridor. Are you hurt? I am whole. But Mrs. Dugan, Jack, they killed her because of me. They killed her because they are evil, Jack said, dragging himself to the bars. He reached his hand through the iron. Eliza, come here. She moved to the bars of her cell. The corridor was only 3 feet wide. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. He caught her hand, holding it tight. His grip was the only anchor in the world. I am sorry, Jack whispered. I should have made us leave sooner. I wanted the 40 acres. I wanted the apple trees. We tried, Eliza said, tears running down her face. We tried to be good. Good doesn't matter to them, Jack said. His voice changed then. The pain and the exhaustion seemed to crystallize into something harder than diamond. He pulled himself up, gripping the bars with his free hand until his knuckles turned white. They called you a witch, Jack said, his voice rough and low in the dark. They took everything you ever built. They killed an old woman just to get to us. And now they want a show. He squeezed her hand. They made a monster out of me in Abilene. Eliza, I spent years trying to put that monster in the ground. I tried to be Jack Cordell. I tried to be a man worthy of you. You are worthy. Eliza sobbed. No, Jack said. Not for this. A good man cannot save us now. He leaned his forehead against the cold iron, staring into the shadows where Eliza stood. Maybe it is time we stop trying to be what they want. Maybe it is time we give them exactly what they are asking for. What do you mean? Eliza whispered, frightened by the tone in his voice. They want a devil, Jack said. They want a killer. He looked up, and even in the gloom, Eliza could see the glint in his eyes. It was not the blue of the sky anymore. It was the blue of the heart of a flame. They called you a witch, he said again. Then let's show them what hell really looks like. He let go of her hand and sat back on the cot, checking his boots, checking the strength in his legs. He began to plan. Not how to run, but how to burn it all down. The hearing was not a trial. It was a butchery of the truth. It was held in the back room of the town hall, a space that smelled of stale tobacco smoke, unwashed wool, and the sour, metallic scent of fear. The windows were shuttered against the cold wind, sealing the heat inside until the air was thick enough to choke on. Eliza sat on a wooden stool in the center of the room, her hands bound behind her back. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a bruise that was turning a sickly shade of yellow. She kept her head high, though her eyes were red-rimmed from smoke and weeping. Beside her, Jack stood in irons. He had been beaten. His left eye was swollen shut. A purple lump of flesh and blood had dried in a dark crust on his chin. He leaned heavily on his right leg, favoring the ribs that the deputies had cracked with their boot heels. Reverend Cole paced the floor like a black bird of prey. He held up a mason jar filled with dried valerian root. "Behold," Cole shouted, his voice bouncing off the timber walls, "the root of the devil, found in the ashes of the schoolhouse. It is medicine." Eliza cried out, her voice rasped. "It is for sleep." "Silence! Witch!" Jebediah Talbot roared from the front row. He sat with his arms crossed, his face a stone mask of grief twisted into hate. The sheriff, acting as the judge, sat behind a table that was scarred with knife marks. He looked tired, but he looked resigned to the path they were on. The accusations piled up like stones on a grave. The death of the Talbot boy, the drought in Rook's Hollow, the fires in Cedar Crossing, Mrs. Dugan's death, which they now claimed Eliza had orchestrated to silence a witness. "And this man," Cole continued, pointing a long, bony finger at Jack, "a killer from the cradle, a man who shoots honest folk for sport. We have heard the reports from Abilene. We know his nature. He is the sword in her hand." Jack spat a mouthful of blood onto the floorboards. "I only ever killed men who were trying to kill me," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous, "which is more than I can say for you. Reverend, you kill with words." "Strike him!" Talbot yelled. A deputy stepped forward and backhanded Jack across the mouth. Jack's head snapped back, but he did not fall. He turned his gaze back to the sheriff. "Finish it, Miller. We know how this ends." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. He shuffled the papers on his desk, avoiding Eliza's gaze. "Eliza Cordell, also known as the Witch of Rook's Hollow, you are found guilty of murder by sorcery, arson, and conspiring with the devil. You are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." The crowd in the back of the room erupted. It was a cheer, but it was a jagged, ugly sound. It was the sound of people who were terrified and wanted blood to wash away their fear. "And the man?" Talbot asked. The sheriff looked at Jack. "Jack Thorne is a wanted man in 3 territories. He has information on other gangs. We will keep him alive. For now. He stays in the iron cell until the marshal arrives next month, or until he decides to repent." "When is the hanging?" Cole demanded. "Tomorrow at dawn." The sheriff said. Eliza let out a small, strangled sound. Jack lunged against his chains, his face twisting in fury. "You cowards!" Jack roared, straining until the veins in his neck bulged. "You are killing an innocent woman. Get him out of here," the sheriff ordered. 3 deputies grabbed Jack, hauling him backward. He fought them, kicking and thrashing, his eyes locked on Eliza. "I will not let them take you," Jack shouted, his voice cracking as they dragged him through the door. "I promise you, Eliza, I will burn this whole town first." The door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. Eliza sat alone on the stool, the jeers of the crowd washing over her. She did not cry. She felt a cold numbness spreading through her chest, a winter that would never end. They dragged Jack to the jailhouse and threw him into the back cell. It was a stone box with no window, only a small grate in the heavy iron door. They did not just lock him in. They shackled his ankles to a ring in the floor and cuffed his hands to the bars of the cot. "Teach him humility," Talbot had said. The deputies took turns. For an hour, the dull thud of fists against flesh echoed in the small stone room. They worked on his ribs. They worked on his kidneys. When they were done, Jack lay on the cold stone floor, curling in on himself, breathing in shallow, wet gasps. The door clanged shut. The heavy bolt slid home. Silence descended, heavy as a shroud. Jack lay in the dark. The pain was a living thing, pulsing with every beat of his heart. But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the agony in his mind. He closed his remaining good eye and saw the faces of the dead, the boy and Abilene, looking surprised as the red stain spread on his shirt, the men he had shot in saloons and dusty streets, and now Eliza, he had failed her. He had taken her from her home, promised her safety, and led her straight to the gallows. "This is it," a voice whispered in his head. "This is the hell you were always riding toward. Jack." "You thought you could be a husband? You thought you could plant apple trees? You are a killer, and killers end up in the dark." He rested his forehead against the cold stone floor. He wanted to let go. He wanted to stop fighting. It would be so easy to just lie here and let the darkness take him. A soft scrape of metal against stone broke the silence. Jack froze. A face appeared at the small grate in the door. It was Deputy Kincaid, the youngest of the sheriff's men. He was a boy of 20, with a face that still held the softness of youth. He looked terrified. "Thorne," he whispered. Jack pushed himself up to a sitting position, gritting his teeth against the scream that wanted to tear loose from his throat. "What do you want, boy? To get a few kicks in?" "No," Kincaid whispered. He looked over his shoulder. "Checking the corridor. I was there," Kincaid said, his voice trembling. "At the hearing, and I was there when Mrs. Dugan, when she was found." Jack went still. "You saw it?" "I saw Talbot's men coming back up the ridge." Kincaid said, "They were laughing." Jack stared at him through the bars. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my mama raised me to fear God," Kincaid said. "And what is happening here? This ain't God. Hanging a woman who birthed half the babies in this county? That is something else." There was a pause. Kincaid fumbled with something at his belt. "I can't open the door," Kincaid whispered. "The sheriff has the big key on a ring around his neck. He is sleeping in the office tonight." "Then what good are you?" Jack rasped. Kincaid slid a thin, flat object through the grate. It clattered onto the stone floor. Then he slid a canteen of water through. "It is a file," Kincaid said. "Hardened steel and water." Jack reached out, his hands shaking, and covered the object. It was cold and rough. "The guards change at 4 in the morning," Kincaid whispered. "Old Pete and Silas take the watch. They play cards in the front room. They get sloppy. The sheriff goes to check the gallows at 5. That gives you an hour where the back is quiet." Jack looked at the young deputy. He saw the guilt eating him alive. "Why?" Jack asked again. "Because I don't want to go to hell," Kincaid said. He disappeared from the grate. Jack heard his footsteps retreating, soft and hurried. Jack took a drink of the water. It was cool and sweet. He washed the blood from his mouth. Then he picked up the file. He looked at the shackles on his ankles. The chain was thick, black iron. It would take hours. Jack did not hesitate. He positioned the file against the weakest link, right near the rivet. He began to saw. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound was tiny, easily masked by the wind howling outside the jailhouse. Jack worked with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. His muscles screamed. His broken ribs ground together with every movement of his arm. Blisters formed on his fingers, then popped, leaving raw, weeping skin. He did not stop. Every stroke of the file was a promise. For Eliza, scritch. For the garden, scritch. For Mrs. Dugan, scritch. For the life they stole. He worked through the night. He worked until his hands were slick with blood and sweat. He worked until the iron began to give. Silver shavings piling up in the dust like glittering snow. In the cell across the hall, Eliza sat with her back to the wall. She could hear the faint scratching sound from Jack's cell. Though she did not know what it was, she thought it might be rats. She held her knees to her chest. She was cold. The dress she wore was thin, and the jail was unheated. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the faces of the people she had helped. Mrs. Sutton and her baby. The little girl with the fever in Rook's Hollow. Mrs. Dugan. She tried to tell herself that her life had mattered, that she had put more good into the world than bad. But then the image of the gallows intruded. The rough rope. The drop. She was not afraid of dying. She had seen enough death to know it was just a doorway. She was afraid of Jack. She was afraid of him watching her swing. She knew, with a wife's certainty, that if she died, the last part of Jack that was human would die with her. He would become the monster they claimed he was. He would burn the world until there was nothing left but ash. "Please," she whispered to the dark. "Don't let him see it. Let him be asleep. Let him be gone." The hours dragged by. The scratching sound stopped. Silence returned. Then, the gray light of dawn began to seep through the high, barred window in the corridor. It was the color of old pewter. Footsteps approached, heavy boots, keys jingling. Sheriff Miller appeared, flanked by 2 deputies. He unlocked Eliza's cell. "It is time," he said. Eliza stood up. Her legs were stiff. She smoothed her torn dress with dignity. "I am ready," she said. They led her out. As they passed Jack's cell, Eliza looked through the grate. She saw him sitting on the cot, his head bowed, his hands shackled to the wall. He did not look up. "Jack," she whispered, "I love you." He did not move. He did not speak. The deputies pushed her forward. She did not know that in the shadows of the cell, the chain at Jack's ankle was severed, held together by a thread of metal and a smear of mud. She did not know that the cuff on his wrist was filed halfway through. She did not know that he was not looking up because his eyes were burning with a focus so intense it would have terrified her. They led her out into the street. The town of Cedar Crossing was gathered in the square. A wooden platform had been erected near the church. It was raw lumber, yellow against the gray sky. A thick hemp rope hung from the beam, swaying slightly in the wind. The crowd was silent. There were hundreds of them, men in heavy coats, women in shawls. Some looked eager, their faces twisted with the thrill of violence. Others looked at the ground, ashamed but too cowardly to speak. Standing on the platform were the architects of this nightmare, Reverend Cole, holding his Bible like a weapon, Jebediah Talbot, looking pale and triumphant, and a third man, Pastor Hale. He had ridden all night from Rook's Hollow to be here. He stood tall and gaunt, his black coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a crow. He watched Eliza approach with a look of supreme satisfaction. "The witch returns to the dust," Hale intoned as Eliza was led up the stairs. The sheriff tied Eliza's hands in front of her. He led her to the trap door. He placed the noose around her neck. The rope was scratchy and smelled of oil. "Do you have any last words?" the sheriff asked. Eliza looked out at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Gable. She saw the blacksmith. She saw the faces of people she had healed. "I forgive you," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "Because you are blind." Talbot stepped forward. "Get on with it. Hang her." Inside the jailhouse, the moment the heavy outer door slammed shut behind Eliza and the sheriff, Jack moved. He planted his feet and wrenched his wrist against the cuffs. He ignored the tearing of his skin. He pulled with everything he had. Snap. The filed metal gave way. His right hand was free. He wasted no time. He bent down and snapped the weak link on his ankle chain. He stood up, shaking the iron loose. He was free of the wall. He moved to the cell door. He pressed himself against the iron, waiting. The outer door opened. It was Deputy Kincaid, looking pale, coming to check on the prisoner one last time. Jack waited until the key turned in the lock. As the door swung open, Jack exploded outward. He slammed into Kincaid, not to hurt him, but to silence him. He shoved the deputy into the cell and grabbed the keys from his belt. "Stay down," Jack hissed. "If you want to live, stay down." Kincaid nodded, eyes wide, shrinking into the corner. Jack ran into the front office. The gun rack was locked. He smashed the glass with the heavy iron shackles still attached to his left wrist. He grabbed a Winchester repeater and a box of shells. He grabbed his own gun belt from the sheriff's desk, strapping it on with trembling hands. He ran out the back door. The town was focused on the square. Jack ran the opposite way, toward the edge of town, toward the Talbot Ranch property that abutted the main street. The main barn, Talbot's pride and joy, was massive, filled with dry winter hay. Jack sprinted toward it, his ribs screaming with every breath. He reached the double doors and slipped inside. He struck a match. He threw it into a pile of oil-soaked rags he found near the lanterns. Then he kicked over a drum of kerosene used for the lamps. The fire caught with a whoosh that knocked him backward. The dry hay drank the flames. Within seconds, the interior of the barn was an inferno. Jack ran out. He found a horse tied to the hitching rail, a nervous roan. He vaulted into the saddle, rifle in one hand, reins in the other. He waited 5 seconds. Boom! The roof of the barn blew out as the heat pressure built. A tower of flame, 50 feet high, erupted into the dawn sky. It was a beacon of pure destruction. In the square, the crowd gasped. Heads turned. "Fire!" Someone screamed. "The barn is on fire!" Horses tied near the square panicked, rearing and breaking their tethers. The crowd surged, confused. That was the moment. Jack kicked the roan into a gallop. He did not ride around the crowd. He rode through them. He came thundering down Main Street, a demon out of the smoke. He worked the lever of the Winchester. Crack! Crack! He fired into the air. The crowd screamed and scattered, diving for the boardwalks. Jack rode straight for the gallows. Sheriff Miller was reaching for the lever to drop the trap door. Jack raised the rifle. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the wood at his feet. Crack! Splinters exploded near Miller's boot. The sheriff flinched, falling backward. Jack reined the horse hard, bringing it to a sliding stop right next to the platform. He dropped the reins and stood up in the stirrups. "Eliza!" he roared. He swung the rifle barrel, smashing it into the face of a deputy who tried to grab his leg. Talbot pulled a pistol from his coat. "Kill him!" Talbot screamed. Jack was faster. He drew the Colt from his hip and fired. The bullet struck Talbot's shoulder, spinning him around. The rancher fell, clutching his arm, his pistol clattering away. Jack leaped from the horse onto the platform. The wood groaned under his weight. Pastor Hale lunged at him, wielding the heavy Bible like a club. Jack backhanded him with the barrel of the Colt. Hale went down in a heap of black cloth. Reverend Cole stood frozen, staring at Jack. "You..." Cole stammered. Jack ignored him. He holstered the gun and pulled a knife from his boot. He grabbed Eliza, slashing the rope around her neck. He cut her hands free. "Jack!" Eliza cried, stumbling into him. He caught her. For a second, the world narrowed down to the feel of her body against his. She smelled of prison damp and terror, but she was alive. "We are going," Jack said. He dragged her to the edge of the platform. His horse had bolted in the chaos, but the sheriff's horse was tied nearby. Jack jumped down, pulling Eliza with him. They landed hard in the dust. "Stop them!" Cole shrieked, pointing from the platform. "Shoot them down." A deputy leveled a shotgun. Eliza saw a pistol lying in the dust, dropped by the deputy Jack had smashed with the rifle. She grabbed it. Her hands shook, but her anger steadied her aim. She fired. The shot went wide, hitting a water barrel, but the spray of water and the noise made the deputy duck. Jack boosted Eliza onto the sheriff's horse. He swung up behind her. "Hold on," he shouted. He spurred the horse. They tore across the square. Reverend Cole, seeing his victory slipping away, ran down the steps of the gallows. He grabbed a rifle from a fallen man. "You cannot escape judgment," Cole screamed. But the fire had other ideas. The wind had carried the sparks from the barn. The dry roof of the general store had caught, and now the church steeple, old, dry wood, was smoking. As Jack and Eliza galloped past the burning barn, the heat was intense enough to singe their hair. The structure was groaning, the main beams eating through with fire, just as Reverend Cole raised the rifle to shoot them in the back. The massive hayloft of the barn collapsed outward. A burning beam, 20 feet long and heavy as a tree trunk, crashed down into the street. It slammed into the ground, sending a wave of burning debris outward. Cole turned too late. The debris wave caught him, burying him under a pile of burning wood and hay. He screamed, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the roar of the fire. Talbot, clutching his bleeding shoulder, sat in the dust and watched. He watched the flames jump from the barn to the bank. He watched the townspeople running, ignoring his orders, focused only on saving their own skins. He watched the witch and the cowboy ride through the wall of smoke and disappear. Jack and Eliza did not look back until they hit the rise at the edge of the valley. They stopped the horse, breathing hard. The animal's sides were heaving. Below them, Cedar Crossing was a vision of the inferno. The barn was a crater of fire. The bank was burning. The general store was gone. The smoke rose in a black column that blotted out the rising sun. Jack wiped blood from his eye. He wrapped his arms around Eliza, pulling her tight against his chest. "They called you a witch," he rasped, his voice raw with smoke and shouting. Eliza looked at the destruction. She saw the town that had rejected her, the people who had tried to kill her, now fighting for their own homes. She felt no joy, but she felt no pity either. She felt a cold, hard finality. "They wanted a devil," Eliza whispered. Jack turned the horse's head toward the mountains, toward the high peaks where the snow was deep and the air was thin. "Let's show them how to vanish," Jack said. They rode away from the fire, leaving the hell behind them, climbing up into the cold, clean silence of the wilderness. The climb into the high country was a slow, agonizing ascent that stripped away the last remnants of the world they had left behind. The air grew thin and sharp, biting at their lungs with every breath. The landscape here was not the soft, rolling hills of the grazing lands, nor the dry, dusty plains of the valleys. It was a cathedral of stone and ice, vast and indifferent to human suffering. Eliza and Jack rode in silence. The only sounds, the clatter of hooves on loose shale and the constant, mournful whistle of the wind through the crags. They pushed the horses hard, driven by the phantom heat of the fire in Cedar Crossing, until the animals stood trembling, their coats frosted with sweat that turned to ice in the mountain air. They slept in the lee of granite overhangs, huddled together under the single blanket in their heavy coats. They did not light fires for the first 3 nights. They ate cold jerky and drank water from streams that were so cold they made their teeth ache. Jack kept his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the back trail, but the smoke of the town was long gone, swallowed by the distance and the curvature of the earth. On the 4th day, the trail vanished entirely. They were forced to navigate by instinct and the lay of the land, guiding their mounts over treacherous ridges where a single misstep meant a fall of 1,000 feet. It was Jack who found the valley. They had crested a ridge, the wind tearing at their clothes. When he pulled the sheriff's stolen horse to a halt, he pointed down. "There," Jack said, his voice rasped by the cold. Below them, cupped in the hands of the mountains like a secret, lay a valley. It was narrow, protected on 3 sides by sheer cliffs of gray stone, and on the 4th by a dense forest of lodgepole pine. A creek wound through the center, a ribbon of silver that did not freeze. Even from this height, Eliza could see the green of spruce and the brown movement of deer grazing in a meadow. "It looks forgotten," Eliza whispered, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "That is exactly what we need," Jack said. "A place the map does not know." The descent was treacherous, sliding down scree slopes and picking their way through dense timber. But as they reached the valley floor, the wind died away. The air was still and smelled of pine resin and damp earth. It was silent, a profound, heavy silence that felt sacred. They set up camp near the creek. Jack walked the perimeter, checking the tracks in the mud. "Eliza," he called softly. She came to stand beside him. He pointed to the soft earth near the water. "Deer," he said, "elk, and no boot prints, no horseshoes. No one has been here in years. Maybe never." They built their shelter against the base of the cliff, using the rock wall as the back of their home. It was brutal work. They had no saw, only the axe Jack had found in the saddlebags and their own hands. They hacked at stubborn saplings, dragging the wood through the brush. They stacked stones to form low walls, mixing mud from the creek with dry grass to chink the gaps. Eliza's hands, once so careful with delicate herbs, became rough and blistered. Her fingernails broke. Her skin cracked in the cold. Jack worked from dawn until the light failed, his muscles hardening, the exhaustion carving hollows into his cheeks. But every stone they laid was an act of defiance. Every log they lifted was a declaration that they refused to die. At night, inside the small, low-roofed shelter, they built a fire in a crude hearth. The smoke drifted up through a hole in the thatch roof. They lay on a bed of pine boughs covered with the blanket, holding each other with a fierceness that frightened them both. "We are safe here," Eliza would whisper into the darkness, her head resting on Jack's chest. "We are alive." Jack would correct her, stroking her hair. "That is enough for now." Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of their life shifted from the frantic pace of the hunted to the slow, steady beat of survival. Jack spent his days setting snares for rabbits and tracking the elk that moved like ghosts through the trees. He saved every bullet, using his knife whenever he could. Eliza explored the valley floor. She found wintergreen growing under the snow in the shaded hollows. She found cattails in the marshy end of the creek, grinding their roots into a starchy flour. She found solace in the simple, brutal facts of their existence. There was no preacher here to call her unnatural. There was no town to whisper behind her back. There was only hunger and the cold, and the man who looked at her as if she were the only source of light in the world. Their love changed in the quiet of the valley. It lost the frantic, desperate edge it had carried since the night of the fire. It became steady. It became the way Jack looked at her across the firelight, a look of profound, settled possession. It became the way Eliza would touch his arm when he returned with fresh meat, a silent greeting that said, "Welcome home." But the wilderness was not the only thing growing in the valley. It was a morning in late winter. The sky was a brittle, aching blue. Jack was sharpening his knife on a smooth river stone. Eliza sat nearby, mending a tear in his coat with a bone needle. She stopped sewing. She looked at the mountains, then at Jack. She had suspected for weeks, but the sickness in the mornings and the cessation of her monthly bleeding had confirmed it. "Jack," she said. He looked up, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. "Yeah?" Eliza set the coat down. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, but from a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion. "I am late. Jack," he frowned, not understanding at first. "Late for what? We have nowhere to be." "No," Eliza said, her voice soft. "I am late." Jack went still. The knife lowered slowly to his lap. He looked at her, searching her face. He saw the certainty in her eyes, and then the fear. "A baby?" he whispered. Eliza nodded. Jack stood up. He walked to the edge of the creek and looked down at the water. He stood there for a long time, his back to her. Eliza felt a spike of terror. Did he not want this? Was a child too much weight for a man already carrying so many ghosts? Then Jack turned. He walked back to her and dropped to his knees in the dirt. He took her face in his rough, scarred hands. "A baby," he said again. His eyes were wet. The hard man, the gunman, the man who had burned a town to the ground, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "I am scared, Jack," Eliza admitted, her voice shaking. "What kind of life can we give a child out here? We are fugitives. We are living in a hole in the ground." Jack pulled her forward, burying his face in her neck. "We give him this," Jack murmured fiercely. "We give him the air. We give him the mountains. We give him a mother who can heal anything and a father who will tear the world apart to keep him safe." But the fear lingered. Later that night, by the fire, the reality set in. "He will have my blood." "Eliza," Jack said, staring into the flames. "He will have the blood of a killer. What if he turns out like me? What if the violence is in the bone? Then he will have my blood too," Eliza said, reaching out to touch his knee. "He will have the blood of a healer. He will be what we make him." "Jack, not what the world says he is. We have to be careful," Jack said, his voice dropping. "I cannot just be a hunter anymore. I have to be a guardian. No one finds this place. Eliza, no one. But the world has a way of finding things that do not want to be found." Spring arrived with a slow, dripping thaw. The creek swelled with snowmelt, and with the thaw came the tracks. Jack found them near the entrance of the valley, where the game trail narrowed between two cliffs. Horse prints, shod horses, 3 of them. He rode back to the shelter, his face pale and grim. "Pack the essentials," he ordered, sliding off his horse. "What is it?" Eliza asked, dropping the basket of roots she had been washing. "Riders," Jack said. "They found the pass." Eliza's hand went instinctively to her stomach, which was just beginning to show the swell of new life. "Is it a patrol?" "No," Jack said, checking the load in his rifle. "A patrol would be 10 men. This is 3. Bounty hunters, or men with a grudge. They could not run. The pass to the north was still blocked by deep snow. The only way out was the way the riders were coming in. "We fight," Jack said. He looked at Eliza. "Can you shoot?" "I can shoot," Eliza said steadily. They moved up the valley to a place Jack had scouted weeks ago, a choke point where the trail passed between a steep rock slide and the creek. It was a natural ambush site. They positioned themselves behind a cluster of boulders. Jack took the high ground, settling into a crevice in the rocks. Eliza took a position 10 yards behind him, hidden by a fallen pine. They waited. The sun climbed high, warm on the rocks, but Eliza felt cold to her bones. An hour later, the riders appeared. They moved slowly, picking their way through the mud. Leading them was a man in a long duster coat, a tin star pinned to his chest. He rode with a slouch that Jack recognized instantly. "Deacon," Jack whispered to himself. It was Deacon Slide, a man Jack had ridden with in the Kansas Range Wars, a man who had turned his coat for a badge when the money got good. He was a tracker, a wolf who hunted other wolves. Behind him rode 2 men who looked like hired guns, rough, bearded, eyes scanning the trees for movement. Jack waited. He let them ride into the kill zone. He breathed in, steadying his hands. He was not fighting for money. He was not fighting for pride. He was fighting for the woman behind him and the child inside her. He sighted on the rock just in front of Deacon's horse. Crack! The shot echoed like thunder in the valley. The bullet struck the stone, sending chips flying. Deacon's horse reared. "Go home, Deacon!" Jack shouted from the rocks. "There is nothing for you here!" Deacon wrestled his horse under control. He looked up at the cliffs, grinning. "Jack Thorne!" Deacon yelled back, his voice echoing. "I knew it was you. You leave a trail like a wildfire. Boy, turn around. Deacon!" Jack warned. "I don't want to kill you. $800 says you won't have to." Deacon laughed. "But the law says you hang Jack, and the woman too." The mention of Eliza snapped something in Jack. The second shot was not a warning. Jack fired. The bullet took the man to Deacon's right out of the saddle, striking him in the shoulder. The man screamed and fell into the creek. "Cover!" Deacon shouted. The gunfire erupted instantly. Deacon and the remaining gunmen dove behind rocks, firing blindly up at Jack's position. Bullets whined off the stone, sending sharp fragments of granite into the air. Eliza, her heart hammering against her ribs, rested her rifle on the log. She saw the second gunman trying to flank Jack, moving through the brush near the water. She took a breath. She aimed. She fired. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the man's foot. He yelped and scrambled back. "She is shooting too!" the gunman yelled. Jack moved, popping up from cover to fire 2 quick shots. He pinned Deacon down. But Deacon was good. He was waiting for the rhythm. As Jack rose for a 3rd shot, Deacon fired. The bullet caught Jack in the side, tearing through his coat and slicing across the old scar tissue on his ribs. The impact spun him around. He fell back into the dirt, clutching his side. "Jack!" Eliza screamed. "I am fine," Jack grunted, rolling onto his belly. "Keep their heads down." Blood was soaking his shirt, hot and fast. He grit his teeth. He dragged himself to the edge of the rock. He saw Deacon moving, trying to rush the position while Jack was down. Jack steadied the rifle on a rock. His vision swam. He forced himself to focus on the silver star on Deacon's chest. "No," he thought, "not the heart. I am not a murderer." He shifted his aim. Bang! The bullet struck Deacon's thigh. The bone shattered. Deacon screamed, his leg collapsing under him. He went down hard in the mud. The remaining gunman looked at his fallen leader, then at the man screaming in the creek, and then at the unseen shooters in the rocks. "I am out," he yelled, throwing his rifle down. "Don't shoot! I am out! Get them out of here!" Jack roared, his voice weak but ferocious. "Put them on their horses and ride. If I see you again, I put the next one in your head." The gunmen scrambled to help Deacon. It took them 10 agonizing minutes to mount up. Deacon was cursing, his face gray with pain. He looked up at the rocks one last time. "This isn't over. Thorn! It is for you," Jack whispered. He watched until they disappeared back down the valley. Only then did he let the rifle slip from his fingers. The world tilted and went gray. Jack lay in the dirt, the pain a dull roar. He felt hands on him, frantic, trembling hands. "Jack, look at me! Look at me!" It was Eliza. She was tearing his shirt open. She saw the blood. "Oh, God," she sobbed. "It is just a scratch," Jack wheezed, trying to smile. Eliza grabbed him under the arms. "Get up! You have to get up!" She dragged him. It was a nightmare journey back to the shelter. 100 yards that felt like 100 miles. She was weeping, her breath sobbing in her chest. But she did not stop. She possessed a strength that came from a place deeper than muscle. She got him onto the bed of pine boughs. She threw wood on the fire, blowing on the embers until they flared. She opened her kit. She had no whiskey. She had no laudanum. She had only her needle and her hands. She washed the wound. It was a deep furrow, carving through the flesh but missing the vitals. But he had lost blood. Too much blood. Jack watched her through half-closed eyes. He saw the tears tracking through the dirt on her face. He saw the green stains on her dress. "Eliza," he whispered. "Hush," she commanded, threading the needle. "Do not speak." She began to stitch. Her hands shook violently until the needle touched the skin, and then, miraculously, they steadied. She was a healer. This was her language. "You are not a monster," she said, her voice trembling as she worked. "Do you hear me, Jack? You let them go. You could have killed them all. But you let them go." Jack hissed as the needle bit. "I wanted to," he admitted. "But you didn't," Eliza said fiercely. "That is the difference. That is what our child will know. He will know his father was strong enough to spare the men who came to kill him." She finished the stitching. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and moss. She wrapped his ribs with strips of her own petticoat. She sat back, exhausted, her hands covered in his blood. Jack reached up. His hand was heavy, but he found her cheek. He brushed away a tear with his thumb. "You saved me," he whispered. Again, Eliza leaned down, resting her forehead against his. "We save each other. Jack, that is the deal." He closed his eyes. "I don't care," he murmured, drifting toward sleep. "I don't care if they call you a witch. I don't care if they call me the devil. As long as we are here, just us." "Just us," Eliza whispered. Jack slept. Eliza sat watch over him, her hand on her stomach, listening to the wind sing through the pines. She looked at the blood on her hands, and then she looked at the fire. She was not afraid anymore. The worst had come, and they were still standing. Months passed. The seasons turned with a slow, inevitable grace of the mountains. The snow retreated from the valley floor, creeping up the peaks until only the summits were white. The creek swelled, running clear and fast. The meadow burst into color, bluebells, paintbrush, and wild columbine. Eliza sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley. She was heavy now, the child sitting low and solid within her. Her hands rested on the curve of her belly. Jack sat beside her. He was healing well, though the new scar pulled tight when the weather turned cold. He was whittling a piece of pine, shaping it into a small horse. "What if it is a girl?" Jack asked. "Blowing wood shavings from the toy? Then she will be fierce," Eliza said, smiling at the sun. "And if it is a boy, then he will be kind," Eliza said. They sat in silence for a while, watching a hawk circle on a thermal. "We will teach them to read," Eliza said. "I have my mother's Bible, and the labels on the jars. I will teach them to ride," Jack added. "And to track, and to heal," Eliza said. "And to shoot," Jack said quietly. Eliza looked at him. "Yes, and to shoot, because the world is beautiful, Jack, but it is not always kind." They had built a life out of ash and stone. They had walked through fire and come out the other side. They knew that down in the flatlands, in the saloons and the churches, people still told stories about the witch of Rook's Hollow and the demon cowboy. They knew that legends were being spun, stories of a couple who had burned a town and vanished into hell. But they were not in hell. Jack stood up and offered his hand to Eliza. She took it, pulling herself up. They stood together, silhouetted against a sky that was streaked with the fading gold of the setting sun. The wind was cold, but it was clean. It smelled of pine and water and future. They were not a witch and a killer. They were a man and a woman who had chosen each other when the whole world told them not to. "Let them talk," Jack said, looking out over their hidden kingdom. "Let them tell their ghost stories. We are real." Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder. She felt the baby kick, a strong, impatient movement. "Yes," she whispered, "we are real." And in the quiet of the valley, as the first stars began to prick the indigo sky, their love stood unburned and unbroken, the soil from which a new life was just beginning to grow. "Thank you for listening to this story." They called her witch, Cowboy said. "Then let's show them what hell really looks like." I hope you enjoyed the journey of Eliza and Jack. I would love to hear your thoughts on their story. Where are you listening from? Do you think they found true peace in the mountains? Please leave a comment below in English. And don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where love and survival go hand in hand. Until next time, keep your powder dry.